Cybersecurity Risk Management Program in your organization was a live webinar that was originally produced on Tuesday, September 25th, 2018. For this webinar, we were joined by two of our team members here at McKonly and Asbury, Mike Hoffner and Dave Hammarberg. We hope you enjoy this recap, and please visit us online at www.macpas.com for more information about all of our future webinars and other upcoming events.
Good afternoon. This is Dave Hammarberg, Principal and IT Director at McKonly and Asbury. I also have with me Mike Hoffner. It's a partner with our audit and advisory practice. He also leads up our SOC audit or SOC practice. So that is the two individuals you'll be hearing from for the next 50 minutes. So we'll get started here.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dave. Before we get started, just want to point out one very recent development in the firm here, and that is that Dave has the pleasure of being our first individual who's been through the AICPA's Cybersecurity Advisory Services Certificate Program. So Dave participated in that program a few months back, and it's a practice area that I think is going to be a significant part of how our firm and other firms serve a growing need in this marketplace. And so if you're familiar with the AICPA's Cybersecurity Advisory Services Certificate Program, and if by any chance any of you on the webinar have been through that program, you may recognize that much of the information contained on the next few slides is actually very similar to what came out of that program. The reason for that is the significant portion of that program is just around a good understanding of cybersecurity risk management and an overview, and kind of look at it and say, why recreate the wheel when there's some great information already out there? And so you'll see a lot of similar information from that program. And something that I think as a firm we're excited for Dave and proud that Dave's been through that and ready to serve our marketplace with that certificate.
Thanks, Mike. Great information. One of the things with just going back to the introductions, I wanted to, just go over being principal and IT director. I wear a few hats in the organization as well as heading up our cybersecurity services. And it's an interesting hat to wear, being IT director as well as cybersecurity services, because from an IT professional's point of view and from a cybersecurity services point of view, oftentimes, you can have a great IT department that runs fantastic and not have a good cybersecurity risk management program. And a lot of times, you get to the IT side, the people that are actually doing the work, dealing with programs, switches, routers, firewalls, etc., and they have all those controls in place, but they don't have a program. Does that mean you have a bad IT department? No, not really. I mean, an IT department could run flawlessly for years and not have an actual cybersecurity risk management program. And for years, you could be fine. The problem is when more and more organizations are requesting, hey, what are you guys doing from a framework standpoint? And a lot of large organizations, can we audit your IT department, et cetera? As the ball goes down the road, it's going to be a point where you're going to start to possibly lose current clients, because you don't have a framework in place. You can't prove, you might be doing all the right things, but you can't prove that you're doing the right things. And then you might be losing potential clients in the future because you might be doing all the right things, but you can't prove it. So that's why it's real important for cyber risk management program to be in every organization, no matter the size. So with that being said, I kind of understand both sides of it is what I'm trying to get at, being the IT director as well as the cybersecurity services. So let's get started with the objectives.
Very good. So let's take a minute and just talk through what our intention is today. And for some of you, you may be really well versed in cybersecurity and in what a risk management program might look like. I will go out on a limb now and say if you are really well versed in cybersecurity risk management and in an organization that is a very mature process in that area, you may not get a lot out of today. Our goal today is really to talk more about what at a high level a cybersecurity risk management program is. I often ask the question, Which is better, a good plan that's really poorly executed, or a mediocre plan that is executed at a very high level? In this case, I think both are important. But before we get into whether we're going to put a good plan in place or execute a mediocre plan, we have to understand what we're planning. So today's goal, and I may put Dave on the spot and say that a future webinar may focus on a little bit more nitty-gritty about cybersecurity risk management program implementation. But today's goal is really to that high level, 30,000 foot. What is a program? What does it cover? What should it look like? What should you think about? If you're a board member at a private company, what are things that maybe you should be asking of your management team? If you're in a management role, what should you be asking of your IT folks? If you're an IT person, maybe, as Dave said, you're really solid understanding of the IT function and the uptime and all the important things in organizational health. But have you asked the right questions on the external cyber threats that all organizations are facing today? That's going to be the majority of our conversation. We'll get into a little bit of a discussion on frameworks that are available when you build your cybersecurity risk management program. There's a variety of ways that you can approach that, different frameworks to base on. Dave, if we have time, we'll wax poetic on that at the end of our presentation. But the information is all in the slides. If we don't get there today, as you download the slides, you'll see more information and can ask questions. And the final objective really is going to be addressed throughout the discussion today. It's not a separate section of our presentation. But throughout the discussion, we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of this effort that we're going to undertake.
And the frameworks we're looking at are security frameworks. You know, there's a lot of frameworks out there. We're not talking about risk management frameworks. And, you know, for a cyber security risk management program, you could be using several frameworks. You could be using underneath one framework of a subset, have another framework, et cetera. So, again, the frameworks that we'll review at the end are security frameworks. And I think, you know, I guess we'll get into that in the next slide, but go ahead.
So before we get into our program, we have a brief poll to ask, and a little bit of this is to understand who the audience is. So if you take a look at your screen, you will see a brief question to ask about where your organization currently resides on the spectrum of a cybersecurity program. So we'll give just a minute for you all to answer that. Does your organization have an effective program at this point? Okay, so we'll just give another couple seconds, a few still weighing in. So excellent. So let's close that poll. So it appears that the majority of our audience has a effective program in place in their mind and in their opinion. A quarter of our group believes they do not. So hopefully we can walk through some of the early stages of how to implement that. And then the 6% of you out there that don't know exactly what a cybersecurity risk management program is, we are the place to be for the next 45 minutes or so, and we will make sure that that question can be answered affirmatively going forward.
That poll was revealing. I didn't expect to see such a high number that actually have an effective program in place. And I imagine if we do a deep dive into those, if we'd come up with the same percentage. The Cybersecurity Risk Management Program, it's a living, breathing document. So it's always changing. If your document hasn't been updated in the last 6 months to a year, then it's out of date and it's not effective. You know, this slide, what is cybersecurity risk management? It's a set of policies, processes, and controls to protect, detect, and recover is really what it comes down to. You know, there's no cookie cutter approach. And one of the, you know, sort of quotes I stole from another presentation that I saw was effective security means human beings picking customized protections. Again, effective security means human beings picking customized protections. There's no cookie cutter approach. You know, each framework, you know, for a health organization, it'll be a different framework than from another organization. And it's really protecting your organization customized to you. So,
Dave, I'm in an organization, and this is hypothetical. Don't, as my IT director, don't take this as pointing at you. If I'm in an organization that I believe has a really sound IT function, can I assume that my IT function is also covering the cybersecurity risk that I might be facing?
No, they're totally different. You could have a well-run security or a well-run IT department and not have a cybersecurity program. So, in other words, all your laptops work fine, your remote connections, your Citrix, your VPN, your programs all work fine, but you don't have a program. And that could go on for years until you have an incident, whether that's a virus, malware, ransomware, and your program is going to help you figure out how to protect that, detect that, and recover. If you don't have a program in place and you have a great IT department, a virus gets into your system, and that virus is meant to gather information, whatever. You first of all, you might not protect it, so it gets in, and you might never detect it. So it might be there for 10 months, 12 months, until the FBI knocks on the door and says, hey, we have all of your data out on the dark web. What is that? Do you guys know that? No. So because we don't have a program, but the IT department's running well. And then how do we recover? Is there an incident response plan? What do we do to make? So again, you can have a great, all your customers or your users are happy, but that doesn't mean you are being effective from a cybersecurity program standpoint. And again, cybersecurity program is the overall title. Frameworks fall underneath that. SOC falls under that, and it's just a broad category at this point in time. And that's there's a bunch of different things that are going to fall on that based on the organization.
So one of the questions we'll come back to as we talk over the next little bit is for those who don't live, eat, sleep, breathe this area, what questions should they be asking? So I'm going to keep that on your radar, Dave, as we go through the next couple slides. What questions should board members or non-information systems and even non-financial levels of management, what questions should they be asking to make sure that they understand what the organizational cybersecurity risk management profile is and what stance the organization is taking? So we'll come back to that, but that's something I think is important to flesh out a little bit as we go today.
Purpose of a CRMP, which we will call a Cyber Risk Management Program from here on out. And this slide is if you're into security or any kind of IT security, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You see that all the time. It's a CIA triad. It's what they call it. And that's what we're trying to do from an IT security standpoint. So confidentiality, integrity, availability. I have a simple example that it's kind of corny, but it kind of goes through those three items there. So here we go. So I go ahead and I open a bank account with a savings account with $10,000. It doesn't matter what bank it is. First National, I go in, I open it up. And the confidentiality part is I only want the bank and myself to know about it. So that would be confidentiality, fairly easy. No one else knows about it. Integrity portion. When I go there in 2 months, I want to make sure that I have 10,000 plus interest in there. If I go there and it's $1,000, someone has done something to my $10,000. Could have been Mike Hoffner. Yeah, who knows? But someone did it, and there's an integrity issue. So again, this is a corny example, but you can think about what these three items mean. So when I go back to the bank in 6 months and I withdraw that maybe $1,000 of the $10,000, is it available? Security that isn't available or security that makes data unavailable really does no good for anybody. If we are completely secure and none of my users can turn on their computer, sure, we're completely secure and no data is going to leak out, but no work's going to get done either. I'm going to lose my job, etc. So, these are three things that we always have to think about in everything we do. We install a program, we do whatever, IT-wise, we have to think about it. And again, this is a screenshot of what you've probably seen before, and exactly what I said. But again, whatever we're doing in an organization, we have to be thinking about this. And I think, 10 years ago we weren't. And more now we are. What a CRMP does. And again, we're here to prevent, detect, and recover. So you'll see a lot of these fall underneath that, defining threats, likelihood of occurrence. That would be a risk management framework, probably under a security framework, determining potential impact, threat level. And I skipped the first one, identifying what needs to be protected. If you don't know what you have, what do you have to protect? If you don't know what are the critical assets, what are you going to protect? And a lot of organizations can't protect everything in the same level, right? So if I have social security numbers, tax information, credit card numbers, I'm going to protect that at a higher level possibly than other things, because the resources to protect everything may be cost prohibitive. There's obviously some things you can do across the board, encryption, that work for everything. But again, if you don't know what you have to protect, it's an issue.
Yeah, I was concerned when you bypassed that first one, Dave. It gets back to that idea of a really poorly designed plan that's well executed versus a really well designed plan that's poorly executed or well executed. And I don't think an organization can define a cybersecurity risk management program without a front end assessment of what exactly our risks are. And that may be protection of the data we have on hand. It may be external threats that just cause downtime because we haven't closed things off appropriately. But to me, the first step, it's great to jump in and do some of these things we're going to talk about and to put together a wonderful, wonderful plan to have a great cybersecurity framework in our organization. But if we haven't taken the front end time to actually establish where's the risk, what are the threats, what are the things we're trying to protect against, likelihood is we'll have a great program in some areas, but what really we're doing is a mediocre program that we might execute at a high level, but still leave ourselves exposed to some fairly significant risks.
You make some great points, Mike. And one of the areas that we've gone into a lot of organizations, and we'll look at controls and we'll map those to frameworks, et cetera. And one of the things a lot of times will happen is they'll have 3 controls mitigating one risk. And you might say, hey, this is going to be costly. We're going to have to put all new controls in. Well, that organization now has 3 controls mitigating one risk, while one control would have mitigated that risk sufficiently for management. But it's costing you 3 times as much. So that's an issue. So knowing what your threats are, knowing your assets, et cetera, could lower the cost of security for you in that instance. But again, if you don't know what you have, you're going to end up, every time you get an email about a new security doodad or whatever, you put an IPS in, IDS in, and you put all these different things in. And what are they mitigating? What are your risks? Do you even have a risk in that area? I'm
curious what the average cost of a security doodad is these days.
It could be very costly.
Hey, and I'm going to ask you a question, Dave, and I think the answer is kind of obvious, but I want to make sure we talk about it today. If an organization puts in a tremendously well thought out cybersecurity risk management program and does a wonderful front end job of assessing what risks need to be managed and engages all the right outside consultants, is that a guarantee that our organization is going to be protected from external cyber attacks?
Definitely, the answer definitely is no. But the answer hopefully is that you'll detect it and you'll recover from it quickly. You'll detect it, you'll communicate to outside people properly. It won't cost the organization more because you didn't do the proper steps. And we'll talk about this down the road, but when you're recovering, do you have the forensic IT people, on call? Do you have all those different areas all lined up? Because at the time, you don't know what to do when you're in a crisis a lot of times. You're sort of frozen. It's like that car accident. You get out and, you exchange insurance stuff, and then you get home and your wife says, "Did you take a picture?" No. Well, you had a phone. Well, you just don't think about it at that time. You need these things written out. It sounds stupid. You should have taken a picture, maybe a video, but you don't do it. And that's why we need these things documented. And if they're not documented, they never happened. So if we're supposed to look at logs daily and we don't have it written down that we checked it off, it doesn't automatically go to the help desk and someone check it off that they looked at the logs, how do we know the logs were actually looked at? It's sort of word of mouth, and IT auditors are going to want to see documentation, and that really comes down to, did it ever happen? Is there documentation? If there's no documentation, it didn't happen.
So part of why I asked that question, which, as I said, I think the answer can be fairly obvious, that you can put a wonderful program in place and it doesn't affirm or guarantee that you're not going to be exposed or impacted by an attack. Part of why I asked that is I think there's a population of folks in oversight roles that assume a really well-run program is going to prevent all sorts of potential disasters. And while they may minimize them, I think it's important for folks who are listening in today who may be in an IT governance role or in a financial management role and understands some of these things. I think it's really important that communication happens upward to shareholders, to board members, to owners. And even though it might sound obvious to say, excuse me, Mr. Shareholder or Chairman of the Board or Mrs. Audit Committee Chair, I just want you to understand all this investment we're making in cybersecurity and a cybersecurity risk management program. It's all important. It's all critical. But it's not going to guarantee anything, and so we need to also do these things to make sure that we're ready for recovery. It may feel uncomfortable to state the obvious like that, but I think it's really critical that as you evaluate your organization's cybersecurity risk management program, that you're communicating it in context of not just how strong our program is or how strong our program will be once we define it, evaluate it, mature it, but also communicate that fact that there are no guarantees in this area, and cyber attacks happen every single day, multiple times a day, and just because we have the best program in place to fit our needs and our risks doesn't guarantee anything. And I think that communication, while maybe can sound fatalist when we say it, is critical to communicate upwards along with the program that we're putting in place.
Correct, Mike. That definitely knowing your risks and mitigating, putting controls in there to mitigate your risk is going to leave you less likely to have a cyber attack or some kind of ransomware event or something, maybe an employee stealing data, et cetera. So that's in place. But we also, part of this program, the recover part, a big part of that is learning. So what if we can learn from our mistakes quickly and adjust, that's going to save the organization time, resources, money, maybe their existence in the future.
So we're going to move on now to our next polling question, which will be live now. So if you take a minute, based on some of the conversation we just had, the primary function of risk management, and select one of the following. Dan, you need to bring your guitar next time so we have some background music during these polling questions. All right, let's give it another couple seconds and then close it down.
All right, well, half of you got it wrong. So we're going to go back to slide 2 and start over. No, just joking. Half of you logged off. So here's the correct answer. The last one, protecting critical assets, bringing risk levels down to tolerable levels. And we can see here, we identified why the other ones were incorrect. Satisfying assessment requirements is the first step in the process of risk management, not the main goal. Again, these were sort of a tricky question because they were all fairly, there was one right answer, but easily could look at the.
There's no wrong answers, apparently, is what you're trying to say.
I wanted to put it as nicely as possible. Identify what information needs to be protected. That is definitely something we need to do, but it's not the goal of a risk assessment, not risk management. Evaluating the effectiveness of IT security and risk management process. Evaluation of the risk management process would need to occur after the proper risk management was in place. So again, the proper answer is protecting critical assets and bringing levels down to a tolerable level. And those tolerable levels, who decides that? Mike, who decides what tolerable levels are?
It's an organizational decision.
Correct. So management working with other areas of the organization. A cybersecurity risk management program is just not IT and management. We got to remember that, and I should have brought that up earlier. You know, a cybersecurity risk management encompasses the whole organization. We got HR involved, which is a huge portion. We got management. We got IT. Everyone should be involved, and everyone should know how to react in different situations. If IT has a great program and they're the only ones who know about it, you know, we've got issues. So again, it's organization wide.
Yeah, and I think to the earlier conversation we had, there is no way to completely eliminate risk. So as an organization, and that is, as Dave said, all levels, we have to determine what is the appropriate level we're willing to tolerate. And in some organizations, that might be a much higher tolerance, that it's just not worth the time and energy because the ultimate exposure is not something we're as concerned about. Where in other organizations, there is an absolute goal to get that accepted risk down to the most minimal level that's possible. But it's going to be a different answer for every single organization, regardless of if you're in the same industry as someone else. The outcome of what your definition of tolerable is very much an organizational decision.
And your consequences of those decisions are going to be different for every organization. You know, if you have a bank versus, you know, a cement company, you might have to protect information a little differently. So again, it's based on your organization, and the consequences for not having that control in place may be a lot different for other organizations. All right, we're going to jump into CRMP controls, and there's three areas of controls: protection controls, detection controls, and reaction controls. And we're going to jump into examples of those, what that exactly means. But you want to make sure that your program is hitting all three of those. You might be doing one great and not the other. And again, I'd go back to that first question we asked: is it effective? Because if you have an effective program, you're going to have all three of those checked off. Are you testing your incident response plan? Are you checking or testing your disaster recovery plan? Are you doing all these different things? If you're not, you know, you may be, and we'll talk about the maturity of sort of different frameworks. You may be, you know, on the right road, but you still have a ways to go. And is anyone 100%? Is anyone done? No. Again, this is a living, breathing document, living, breathing program that's going to continually change. So if you go in and you ask your IT or whatever, hey, do we have an effective program and are we done with it? And they say, yes, we're done with it. We finished that 3 years ago. Well, you have a problem.
Before we jump into the examples, Dave, I just want to highlight, and if I had thought ahead, I would put a slide in where one of these words turns bold and red, but I didn't. So I want to draw attention to the second word in the first bullet point, and that is proper. So it's one thing to have controls in all three of the areas that Dave's going to talk about. I think it is absolutely critical, back to that idea of a front-end assessment of what our risk areas are. It's also critical to say, are we identifying the right controls and the most effective and efficient controls to manage our risk in each of these areas? So it's one thing to be able to put a chart together that maps, here's our key risk areas in the cybersecurity area, and here's the 27 controls that we've put in place, identified. We continue to evaluate, monitor, and upgrade them, and they all map back, and I've covered all those risk areas. That's wonderful, but we have to sit back and think, are they the right controls for the organization? Do they really cover the risk the way we think they do? And so have we identified not just controls that cover both protection, detection, and reaction, and all our risk areas, but are they the right controls? Are they the proper controls for what we really should be doing as an organization?
Protection controls. Examples of protection controls would be controls that restrict access to appropriate personnel, possible annual cybersecurity awareness, training controls, something up that line. You know, how is privileged access to information systems? How is that requested? How is that, you know, who approves that, et cetera? So those would be protection controls. Do you have those in place?
Yeah, I think from a protection perspective, or I often use the term preventative controls, we often think about the actual system controls. Do we have the correct switches set the right way? Do we have outside access locked down and restricted, dual factor authentication, all the things that would keep our systems secure from outside cyber attack? But Dave mentioned one that I think is critical, which is just the simple idea of training. And we don't often think of training as a control. So you can do a wonderful, effective job of locking down your systems and doing all the right things to prevent cyber attacks and cyber threats. But if you don't educate your employee base top to bottom on some of the things that they should be aware of, phishing attempts, all the little things, things as simple as we often think about, logging in on a public network. If we don't educate, then we could have all the best controls in place, and we could very easily have a cyber security threat, an event that we weren't banking on, we weren't prepared for. So I do think, Dave, your point of training being a control is something that we need to talk about more. And not all of the companies we work with recognize that as effective a control as it really can be if done right.
And I focus on IT controls, obviously, because that's my arena. But another protection control could be background checks from HR. So there's other controls outside of IT. I sort of lean towards the IT just because that's somewhat of my focus at times. Also, access badges to the building, that would also be a protection control. And there was one other. Yeah, let's go ahead and move on.
I already did. Sorry.
Obviously, I missed that. All right, detection controls. Oh, I'm going back to protection controls. I just remembered. So a good example of a program that works, and this is a client, is they do have, they discovered, hey, we need dual factor authentication. So they have dual factor authentication on all of their different remote access, VPN, Citrix, remote desktop. All of that is VPN. And they had an incident where they had an email, a phishing email that was clicked on, and that individual, the employee, the user, actually filled in their username and password. Well, not a huge issue. They can't get into the network. They can't log in, but they can get into that person's email. So it was detected. And what do you do to recover? And how quickly can you recover, right? If it takes 3 months to recover, how much information did they get from that email? Were they able to email other people? What exactly were they doing? So, that organization quickly changed the password, et cetera, but they also learned from that situation and they put dual factor on their email. So that was an important learning experience. And that's how it should work, and the proper way. So now I will move into detection controls because they are urging me to move on. Detection controls. So what are examples of detection controls? Logging. Are you logging your network traffic, logs on your firewall, logs on your IDS or IPS, intrusion prevention system, or intrusion detection system? What are you doing? If you have those in place and you're not looking at them, what good are they? So those are different areas. Identifying vulnerabilities, monitoring user access for both privileged and non-privileged user accounts, security audits for compliance, periodic security assessments to identify potential threats. And there could be various detection methods, and they could be unique for the organization. So you have to identify what they are and make sure that they're documented and they can be audited. I mean, that's really comes down to, because if it can't be, then did you really do it? If Mike says he did it, but we can't prove he did it, did he do it? That's the question.
But I affirm that I did. But I think where that's important, so we think about two aspects. One is if you're having an external evaluation, whether that be a SOC examination, where those controls need to be tested, or a different type of certification, that's one aspect of where those controls need to be documented and the evidence that they've been functioning needs to be documented. But the other aspect of that is if you think about the risk you face from a stakeholder perspective, whether that's your customers or the public, if an event happens, And while there will absolutely be reputational risk if an event happens in your organization, if you can demonstrate to those that were impacted that you had done everything that could be expected or should be expected of an organization that's being entrusted with data, if you can demonstrate that you have enacted a good cybersecurity risk management program, again, it doesn't mean nothing will ever happen. But if you can demonstrate that you took it seriously and you did things the right way, and you can evidence that you put a program in place and performed and evidence those controls, I believe it is possible to significantly minimize that reputational damage, because you can have the right conversations that say, look, I acknowledge that there was a problem. I acknowledge that there was an event that we need to deal with, but let me show you what all I've done and how I'm trying my best in this environment where there is risk and every financial institution is getting hit with cyber attack after cyber attack. Look, we're doing the right things. Whereas if I don't have any evidence that I've put this program in place and documented it, I have no ability to go back to my stakeholders who are asking me questions. My customers are asking questions. Well, this happened. What were you doing to prevent it? I get it happens, but what were you doing to prevent it? Or other customers saying, you had an event. What are you doing now to make sure it doesn't happen again or minimize the risk that it's going to happen again? So I think that documentation, it's not just I need to prove that I did it, but it's I also need to have some conversation that can be had with my stakeholders after an event to show them that I wasn't taking this lightly. Things happen in today's day and age, but I didn't take it lightly, and unfortunately, I still had an event. So I think that's important.
Yeah, you can't protect from something that you don't know of. And a 0-day attack, meaning there's no one's seen it before, or there's nothing to be put in place to prevent it. A 0-day attack occurs. It's going to hurt your organization, but like Mike said, if you have the proper controls in place, and that's going to help you on the reputation, et cetera. So it could definitely happen, but hopefully not. Reaction controls. Again, this is the last of three controls designed to address or reduce risk after a malicious event. Again, I talked about the email situation, changing the password. What was the incident response? Are you documenting the situation? Are you getting IT forensics involved to make sure that person indeed only got to email? What are the proper controls? And doing it in order, quickly, and effectively. Are you practicing incident response procedures with all staff? Are they aware of their roles and actions during the crisis event? Again, if IT only knows and HR doesn't know or management doesn't know what to do, what's going to happen? Probably not what you want to happen. And again, updating the incident response policy. If you're not updating that 6 months to a year, it's probably out of date, and you need to relook at that. Forensic IT, is that person still around that you're going to call? Are those vendors still around? Did your vendors change? How effective are those? In a real life event, is it really, are those critical assets still your critical assets? Is that protected information in the same area? All that stuff is important, and needs to be able to be read by multiple people. The IT director's on vacation somewhere without a cell phone. Someone else has to pick up that incident response plan and be able to work it. It's important.
Yeah, and one of the things related to this post-event, so the reaction controls and the process is important. One of the things we haven't talked about, and this discussion is not intended to cover, but certainly something you should all be aware of is what level of coverage your organization has regarding insurance for cyber events, cyber attacks. And most of the time, it would not be covered under a general policy. They're separate standalone policies, and certainly in today's environment with the number of attacks and the threats that are occurring on a daily basis, having some understanding of what your organization's coverage is in that arena is critical, because in the event of an attack, you need to know where to turn and who to talk to and what your exposure is and what the next steps are, not just from a controls perspective that Dave talked about, but just from a financial and organizational coverage perspective.
And the time to figure out if you have cyber and security insurance is not after the incident. Right, a lot of organizations like, oh, I'm sure I'm covered. Probably not. You need a special policy, and a lot of times organizations will use that as a mitigating factor to a risk they identify. And a lot of times insurance agencies will request different things: your disaster recovery plan, your incident response plan, all these different plans. And if you don't have them, you're going to pay through the nose. So it's nice, good to have all those in order, and have a good cybersecurity insurance. So.
Excellent. So our next stage before we go on to our further discussion is our final polling question of the day. So we're going to ask the question, as soon as I see what the question is, Dan. There it is. Do you believe your organization has in place adequate protection and detection controls relative to cybersecurity? So early on, we asked, do you have an effective program in place, and got 75% positive on that. So this is kind of a follow-up to that question. Do you believe your organization has effective controls, which is really part of that cybersecurity risk management program? So we'll give a few more seconds. Looks like most of the folks are in. So it looks like a few less of you are confident that you have effective controls in place than were confident that you had an effective program in place. So I agree with Dave's comment a little bit earlier in our discussion. Dave made the comment that if we really looked underneath the hood and really unpacked this cybersecurity risk management program, and I trust every single one of the individuals who's on this webinar, and I believe their answer was sincere and honest, but I also suspect that 75% of the individuals who are participating probably don't have as effective a cybersecurity risk management program as they believe they do. And I think this poll is trending in the right direction to where I would expect it to be. I think if we continued to really unpack over another 2 or 3 hours what should be involved and what kind of daily and weekly and monthly updates are necessary, I think these percentages might continue to drop in terms of who answers yes. And that's not because you're over-exaggerating. It's just, I think once we really unpack what's involved in truly having an effective cybersecurity risk management program, we realize that there's way more to it than a lot of folks think about and understand.
It's a complex situation. If you're starting from scratch, it could easily take you 6 months to a year to put all these things in place if you have a full-time individual doing just that. So it's not something that happens overnight where we have a policy and we say, hey, we're good to go. A lot of times we go into organizations and we get a lot of pushback from the IT because they think we're there to blame. It's not a blame game. We're here to help. Get your, we don't want you spending the weekends here fixing from ransomware or, this is supposed to help the organization. And when, if we help organizations with their programs, we're there as it's supposed to be a learning objective and to improve the organization. So I know one organization we're dealing with now, that individual has a hard time because they think, oh, I'm doing something wrong. Well, your IT department is functioning just fine. It's just you don't have a program in place, and we have to, change some controls around, etc. So, again, I just wanted to point out that we're not, when we come in, IT doesn't get fired, and etc. It's a learning experience.
Good. So as we're coming into the home stretch here, Dave, on our time on this webinar, we want to save just a few minutes at the end to talk about the frameworks. And again, there's a lot of slides on the frameworks at the end of the presentation. As you download those slides, I would encourage you to read through them because we will not go through all of those. But I want to have a real brief discussion here before we jumped into the frameworks. And the question on the screen is a little bit of a reiteration of what you already talked about, some of the protection, detection, and reaction controls you would expect. But I'm going to flip that on you just a little bit and throw a curveball at you, Dave. And I would like you to talk about, instead of specifically this question, let's go back to that idea of what should somebody in a governance position be asking their IT department or their management team about controls that are in place or should be in place as part of an effective cybersecurity risk management program. What should I be looking for as an outsider to say, is my organization doing things that allow me to sleep at night on this topic?
If I was looking for something like you're saying there, I would be asking, what framework is our organization adhering to? Because if you're not adhering to a framework, a security framework of some kind, you're most likely missing out, right? Because most organizations are picking a framework and going with that, and they're picking that because it's best practices. It's not a standard; it's best practice, and they're adapting their information to that framework, and they're mapping their controls. If you're not doing that, then what are you doing? What are you missing? Right? What questions aren't you asking? So I want to know, what framework are you using? Not necessarily I care which one you're using. Now, if you're healthcare, you'd be using one framework for sure, but other frameworks, they could work just as good for one or the other. But I want to know what framework you're using. So if I'm management, I'm going to ask them, what framework?
As a tremendous segue into our next section of the presentation. So with that, Dave, why don't you talk about what answers I should expect once I ask that question?
Correct. So we're going to go through this pretty briefly. Security frameworks. Again, they align policy, standards, procedures. They're going to align controls that we have in place to a document, so that auditors coming in, et cetera, we can map back and forth. And obviously, everyone on the webinar can read. I'm going to go to the next slide. I think they can read. No, just checking. I just got the dirtiest looks from everyone in the room. But anyway, comprehensive set of leading practices. It's a blueprint for building information cybersecurity. If you don't have that blueprint and you're just, imagine building a house without blueprints. You've got 20 people building a house and they have no blueprints. What is that house going to look like? You might have 7 doors in the garage. Do you need 7 doors in the garage? No, you don't have a blueprint. You need a blueprint beforehand. Your overage costs on that 7-door garage is going to be a lot more than if you did blueprints to begin with. So again, blueprint. So let's move on. Benefits, adopting security framework, focus on high risk. And again, the last one, the use of criteria that is vetted by the industry. Like I said, healthcare is going to use one set of framework. But again, you have a ton of people putting data into these frameworks. Let's use it. Best practices. If you think you're smart enough that you can create your own framework, I'm sure there are people out there, but I wouldn't recommend it.
And I think a lot of times as a IT department or an IT head, you're asked not just what your cybersecurity position is or your program is, but specifically an outsider, whether it's an internal audit department at a major customer, they want to know which framework you're using. And if you put forth something that they're not familiar with and that is not a vetted industry standard, the likelihood of that major customer or client's internal audit department being comfortable with your position, it's a lot lower. Now, that doesn't mean you won't get there, but I think the use of an accepted framework allows some consistency that the other side, your customer, the public, they'll understand what you're doing just because you're using something that's well accepted and vetted.
Exactly, and that's perfect. Like a SOC report. You could be doing the same things and call it something totally different. But if it's not a SOC report, the vendor is not going to rely on it as well. So cybersecurity standards, what is a standard? And I threw this slide in there. A standard is a rigid mandatory requirement, right? So example of a standard would be like ISO 9001. Details how quality management systems get put in place for organizations. I just mentioned that standard because it's very specific.
So it's kind of like a blueprint versus a building code, right? Your blueprint gives you the picture of what you should be doing. The building code says these are things you have to follow when you put that garage up.
That is a perfect example. Let's go to the next slide. And this is exactly what you said, a framework for a standard. So we're going to jump in, and we're only going to go through a couple more slides. I think maybe two more slides, and then we're going to probably open this up to maybe another webinar, just identifying the different frameworks. But common security frameworks and standards, you can see here. I meant to go through each one and kind of give you the pros and cons and whatnot. But let's go ahead to the next slide where there's a comparison. And this comparison here is the different security frameworks. Again, these are just security frameworks. They're not risk. Some of these have some risk management in them. But again, the NIST CSF. cybersecurity framework is voluntary guidance. Use it a lot when organizations are new to this. It's sort of an easy framework, and it maps to other frameworks. NIST SP 853, again, we're going to go through these in detail. If you're a government agency, you would have to use these if you do work for government agencies. And you can read here, ISO 27001. If you're a healthcare client, you would use High Trust, CSF, COBIT for SOX compliance, so if you're a public company. And SAN CIS. Now, that's mostly IT related, so that would probably be a subset of another framework. But again, each one of these we could speak 50 minutes on. So I just want to let people know they're out there. Any of these can be used. All of them are good. Depends on your organization. And I think that's probably all the time we have for today.
Yeah, so I think as we look at questions from the audience, we'll take just a minute to wrap things up. Feel free to pose any other questions. If we don't get a chance to talk about them right now, we'll circle back on those individually. So, Dave, the one question that is asked, and I think is specific for you from an IT director's perspective, is how do I get a board or a management team to understand the investment needed in cybersecurity versus general IT matters? Because it is a budgetary line item. I'm interpreting it's a budgetary line item, and I think you had earlier on a slide that there's a justification of spend when you put the framework together. But the question is, how do I convince the leadership team that there is a necessary spend on a cybersecurity program above and beyond a traditional IT budget?
Well, I think there's a couple answers to that question, a couple ways you could get that budget. And one of those is just saying, are we going to be able to keep our clients for the next 10 years? Are those clients going to require some kind of framework present, some kind of audit? And what about the potential clients? Are they going to hire us without having some kind of IT audit, et cetera? So those would be two. And then the other thing is every day we're hearing about organizations closing down, having some kind of attack, and costing them thousands and millions of dollars. Most organizations in Central PA, they might not exist if they have a breach, if they don't do things correctly the first time. So if the fear of losing revenue isn't good enough, maybe the fear of not being in existence would convince a budget. Now, of course, you're going to have to go in with smart objectives, meaning, what are you going, what are the controls you need, et cetera, and you're going to have a plan. And part of the reason you sometimes hire individuals is to come up with a plan and to deliver that to management. A lot of times, IT department will be like, well, we've been saying that for 5 years. Can you put this in our report? Well, sometimes the third party is just what it needs for management to turn over. So I'll just add that in there.
Good. Fair enough. Fair enough. So second question, and it's the only other one I see. So if there are others, please pose them now or we're going to wrap up. Second question, you've used the phrase twice, and I'm paraphrasing this, but you've used the phrase twice that it's a living, breathing process and needs to be constantly updated. And you threw some time frames out there. But the question, as I'm seeing it, is what is the frequency with which a formal cybersecurity risk management plan should be updated and revisited?
It really depends on who you ask, but if it's over 1 year, I would say it's outdated and you need to look at it. I would say every 6 months. But, that every time you have an incident, you're going to be learning and you're going to be changing. And every time you have a risk management, you're going to be updating those controls. Every time you have a major change in your organization, whether that's a merger, an acquisition, or a new software program, your risks are going to change. And at that time, your document for your cybersecurity risk management program is also going to change. So if you're an organization that has no change, meaning you have the same program, same data, same employees, and you don't change, maybe annual is enough, but there's not a whole lot of organizations out there like that.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. Before I turn it back over to Dan to wrap us up, I just want to point out if you download the slides, and the link was available, if you download the slides, you'll notice that we stopped about 15 or 20 slides short of the end of the presentation. The reason for that is those last series of slides really unpack some details on the various frameworks that Dave presented at a high level. So if you download those slides and take some time to read through the frameworks, the various attributes of them, why you might choose one over the other, and you have questions, I would invite the conversation to Dave or to although I'll probably pass it on to you, Dave. If there are specifics on why I would choose a framework or what it means or some of what you're seeing in those slides, please feel free to reach out. But I did want to point out that we intentionally bypassed on the webinar portion of the presentation a number of slides that you will see if you download the slide deck.
Thank you once again for joining us for this webinar recap produced by McKonly and Asbury. We hope you join us for all of our future webinars, and you can stay connected to us, learn more about all of our upcoming events by visiting www.macpas.com. Thanks again, and have a great day.